Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's true crime video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this craziness, today you and I were able to find each other on this wild planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or BRATTERSTEIN, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the disappearance of 14-year-old Cayce Lynn McDaniel. Cayce went missing from her home in 1996 with no sign as to where she went, and even though there was whispers around the small town where she lived, the locals and even some of her family seemed to have a pretty good idea what happened. To law enforcement, it was a mystery, and it was a mystery that stayed hidden for over 20 years. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us, one of us, one of us. And you can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. They're all BRATTERSTEIN, but no pressure. Now, before we get started, I need to say a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, and that is Skillshare. And if you've been here before, you know that I love Skillshare. And if you're anything like me, you'll love Skillshare too, because Skillshare is an online learning platform where lifelong learners can go and learn skills that'll benefit them for a lifetime. And I don't know if you know this about me, you probably do if you've been here before, but I am the type of person who is just that, a lifelong learner. I teach myself everything, particularly where this channel is involved. I have taught myself completely how to do all of it. I've figured out how to do everything with this channel myself. I'm a solo production from writing, researching, editing. Everything is just me because one, I am a control freak, and two, I just like to be the person with the knowledge, and Skillshare helps me get the knowledge, you know? So if you're anything like me, you will love Skillshare because it's an online learning community that offers thousands of classes to a community of members across 150 countries. I know, that's a lot. And they offer these classes in a variety of subjects, from classes on things like yoga, parenting tools, and a ton of classes on video editing, and just social media in general, which is great for me considering literally what we're here doing right now, videos, right? Right. So recently I found this really good class, a great class that I've been taking, and it's called Short Form Video, Create Viral Videos for Instagram Reels and TikTok, that's taught by a man named Sean Dalton. And I've really been enjoying it because, I mean, it's in the name. It teaches you how to create short viral videos. And I've mentioned this before, but I'm trying to get better at specifically that so that I can create TikToks that will go viral that can then bring new members of the Brat Pack over to my YouTube channel. And it's a lot harder than you would think, but Skillshare makes it a lot easier because it's from people who know what they're doing, and I don't know what I'm doing. And that's just one of the reasons that I find Skillshare to be beneficial for my life. If you were to become a Skillshare member, you would have access to a multitude of classes on basically any subject that your heart desires. And the thing that's most important to me personally, well, there's a lot of things that are important, but one of the most important things to me personally is that you can do it at your own pace. You don't have to go on anyone else's schedule. And for a new mom, me, who works from home, that is invaluable. With that said, Skillshare is offering the first 1,000 members of the Brat Pack to click the link at the top of my description box a free month, to explore all of the classes that Skillshare has to offer. And that's a pretty good deal because it's one of those things that once you get in there and you see what they have, you're gonna be like, oh, so this is what I'm gonna be doing from now on. So if you're like me and you wanna join a community of rad lifelong learners and you wanna dive into a community that shall help you learn skills that will benefit you for a lifetime, make sure to click the link at the top of my description box to get 1 month free to peruse all Skillshare has to offer today. And now I just want to say one last thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. And of course, thank you guys for always being so supportive of all of my sponsors. You rock. Don't ever change. Okay, we can go ahead and get into this video. Now, this is a video on a case that was suggested to me by a subscriber named Brittany. Hi, Brittany. Thank you. Brittany, weird to say considering my name is Brittany as well. Anyways, this video is particularly important because this is a case that is near and dear to Brittany. One, it's local. It's something that happened in her small town, so that's already something that can hit you a little bit differently, right? And on top of that, Brittany is friends with Cayce's brother, which just makes it even more personal and a little bit closer to her heart. So though all cases that we discuss here are important and are special and all of these people matter, this one is a little bit unique in that there is such a close proximity to a member of the Brat Pack. With that said, it's a very frustrating case. It was a cold case for many, many years, which is already super frustrating. And it's made even more frustrating by the fact that it seems like so many people knew what happened, but it wasn't able to be proved for such a long time, and nothing was really done about it. And that's always such a frustrating thing. So I read all the things, I did all the research, and now I have it all in like a nice, concise little package so I can tell you the story today. And when I am done, once I've given you all the details, I want you to answer the question of the day, and that is this. What do you think happened? What do you think really happened the night that Cayce McDaniel disappeared? Okay, with that said, come gather round and let me tell you the story of the disappearance of Cayce McDaniel. Okay, to get started, we're going to jump in our handy dandy time machine and we're going to head to 1996 in Milan. M-I-L-A-N. I want to say Milan. I wrote it down and I memorized it, but my brain doesn't retain it properly because Milan is just where it wants to go. But I think it's Milan, Tennessee. Milan was a small town of less than 8,000 people where community was a big part of day-to-day life. Everyone was friendly, saying their hellos and their good mornings, going to like high school football games. It was a type of place where people who lived there shopped local and were proud to live there. I have to be honest, those kind of places always sound like quaint and adorable, like, right? Like that's what you picture, but to me, it always freaks me out because in my head, I'm like, small town. Everyone knows everyone. Everyone's super close. You're probably good buddies with like the local sheriff, and it seems like a very like perfect place to keep a secret. But that's just always been my take with small towns. Probably because of what I do here. Now, this is where 14-year-old Cayce Lynn McDaniel lived and would unfortunately, presumably, be killed. And I don't say presumably be killed because I'm not sure if she died. I'm saying presumably it was done in Milan. Of course, it could be somewhere else. I'm just assuming there because they haven't determined exactly where it took place, but it was finally determined that she was murdered. But it took 20 years, over 20 years, for them to come to that conclusion. On August 16th, 1996, Cayce had gone to a back-to-school party at the Double Springs Church just outside of Milan, with her best friend Amber. She had just started her freshman year in high school the day before, as many kids did, and this was their back-to-school party, and it was supposed to be a really fun night, and it presumably was a fun night based on all reports. The church was centrally located, so it had kids from a few different schools, and there was pizza, and a local band played, and Cayce was said to be in a very good mood. She danced, she ate, she got to hang out with her friends. It was just like a good time. It was Cayce's youth group that actually set up this dance. So when the dance was over, her friend Amber and a couple of other friends stayed behind to help clean things up. And when they were done cleaning things up, Cayce got a ride home from a woman who was at the church. It was a woman named Pam, who was like a family friend. She drove her home and did like the responsible thing. She sat outside and watched Cayce walk up to the dark house. So the lights were off. Cayce went, she opened the door, she unlocked it, turned on the lights, came back out, waved goodbye, and that was the last time that anybody saw her. Amber said of seeing her best friend for the last time ever that night, and I quote, "Everything was fine and normal, and if I'd known that was the last time I talked to Cayce, I don't know what I would have said. But that's how it always is. We never know when we'll see someone for the last time." Now, Cayce wasn't the only one who went out and had some fun at a party that night. Cindy, which was Cayce's mother, and Cindy's boyfriend Steve, which was Cayce's mom's boyfriend, Steve, okay? They had gone to a party as well. They went out to a separate party, did their adult things, and got back to the home between 2 and 3 a.m. And when they got back to the house, nothing seemed too weird initially. I guess when they got there, the back door was open, and some people thought that that was weird. Like, there's so much with this case. So basically, later, Cindy came out in an interview and said sometimes when you would, like, open the front door, the back door would unlatch, so it wasn't immediately odd to them when they saw the back door open. But the scene definitely got weirder from there, and it's at this point, the next things that I saw, that she saw, that I would have been like, damn, maybe something's going on. So they go into the house and they realize that Cayce had been there. Her clothes that she had been wearing to the dance, like her special dance outfit, was there. I think it was like laid out on the bed, like she had taken it off. I could be wrong on if it was laid out on the bed. Don't quote me on that, but I know that the clothes were there in the room. The lights were on, the TV was on in her room, and she had like a bowl of crushed up cookies with milk in it sitting next to the TV, presumably waiting for her to eat it, but she was nowhere to be found. And I did see it reported that there were also scratch marks like on the hallway walls which is like, what? But I also saw that it wasn't confirmed if the scratches were there prior to her going missing or not. If they were not there before and they were there then, I would have been like, what the fuck? I would immediately think something was wrong. But we don't know for sure if the scratches were there before or after. Now, this is strange to me, I'm not gonna lie, because if I had seen the scene, I would have definitely thought that something was weird. I don't know if maybe teenagers often leave their home with their snacks just like chilling in front of the TV. I don't have any teenagers in my life. I just have a little tiny baby. Maybe, you know, kids do that all the time. Maybe they're messy, nasty little things. But Cindy and Steve didn't freak out right away when they saw that. They didn't think anything was wrong. Cindy said that she assumed that Cayce had just left to go stay at a friend's house. And so they didn't freak out. They didn't call the cops or anything. Why? I don't really know. I don't know the mindset there. I know that it was reported that they were both, her and Steve were both really drunk when they got home. So maybe that could have something to do with it. But if Cayce had left on her own, she would have left in just her pajamas, which was like boxer shorts and a t-shirt and no shoes. And she never came home again. Cayce Lynn McDaniel was born July 14th, 1982. And she was born to parents Cindy and Ronnie, but the relationship didn't last like very long after Cayce was born. I'm not sure how long they were together before that, but the two separated and Cayce stayed with her mom and her little brother Jesse, and Cayce's older brother Randy, he was 11 years older than her, went and lived with their father Ronnie out of state. And Ronnie, sadly, just for a side note, died like tragically in a house fire, which is just absolutely horrific. And this was her father, her biological father, who died in the house fire. Cayce was known as a girl who just loved to have fun. She was a bubbly girl, always having a smile on her face, who could easily make friends with anyone she met. And she was always the little girl who tried to like tag along with the older kids, particularly her older cousins, who she was very close with. And they would put up with her because, you know, they were older and they would just be like, oh, this little girl wants to hang out with us all the time. But they were family and they loved her. She was just a little girl who loved reading Nancy Drew books and having what those who knew her considered to be, quote, unusual snack preferences. She was known as just being like a total sweetheart. Like I told you that she had an older brother, Randy, who was like 11 years older than her. Well, I guess while he was overseas in like the Marines, she sent him a photo of her with like a little yellow ribbon. And I guess a yellow ribbon shows like support and solidarity for the military that is overseas. So she was just like a little sweet thing that thought about other people. She was said to be the type of girl who never knew a stranger. She was the type of person who, if you were around her, you couldn't help but laugh and smile because she was just like very silly. She was the light in any room. She was the type of girl who would share her doll with her cousin at Christmas when her cousin was jealous that Cayce got the cooler present. She was the type of person who would make any kid feel loved and put everyone else first. Once a boy, like I saw a reporting, there was once a boy who was at a skating ring, like a skating rink, not ring, and was touched because Cayce like skated over to him and like took his hand to see if he wanted to skate with her because he was one of the only people who didn't have a partner. And this like stuck out to him because she was just that type of person. Cayce was a good student. She had gotten straight A's in middle school and was particularly good at algebra, and she had just started She had just started high school. And now that she was in high school and she was getting a little older, she started to rebel like a little bit. She started to dress goth, which to her church friends, like parents at the church and people in the small town in Tennessee in the 90s, that was like shocking. They were like, oh my God, what is going on with this little girl in her goth outfits? But she was still a good kid. Like, did she rebel a little bit? Yes. Did she go a little goth? Yes. Did she smoke cigarettes and date an older boy? Yes. But she was still like a good kid. A teenage girl about to come into her own in her last few years as a child before becoming an adult, with plans to go off to college to become a physical therapist. And her best friend Amber said she was really excited about starting high school. Now, Cayce and Amber were close. They had met in the 6th grade, and ever since then they had become inseparable. And they were so close that it wasn't uncommon for them to stay at each other's houses, and it got to be so commonplace for them to do this that they wouldn't even always ask for permission. They would just do it. And I had a best friend like this in high school too. Me and her were like this. We were always together. If we weren't together, they were like, where's your shadow? Like, we were those kind of people, right? And so when Cayce still hadn't come home the next day after her mom found that scene with the milk and cookies, anyways, when Cindy was like, okay, she still hasn't come home, she went to find a phone to call. Because I guess they didn't have a house phone. So she went somewhere. And she called Amber and was like, put Cayce on the phone. She wanted to kind of scold her a little bit and give her a little bit of a hard time for not at least leaving a note and letting her know where she was. And when she called and Amber told her, like, she's not here, that's when Cindy was kind of like, okay, that's weird. She didn't sound especially worried to Amber, but she was like, okay, can you do me a favor? Call all your friends, find out where she stayed, and tell her like to call me or to get her butt home. So Amber does just that, but with each person she calls, she finds that nobody has heard from Cayce. So she gets back in contact with Cindy and she gives her that information, and that's when Cindy seems to worry a little bit. And since she didn't have a car, or somebody had her car at the time, she asked Amber like, hey, will you ask your parents to come pick me up and we can go and look for her? But at the time Amber's parents weren't home yet, so they waited. Amber's parents got home. Amber told her parents what was going on, and they were like, okay, let's go get her. They go and pick her up, Cindy that is, and they start driving around and looking for her. They go to a few places, including Cayce's uncle's house, and she's nowhere to be found. So this is when they go to the police station to file a missing persons report. And meanwhile, while this is happening, since Amber had called around and told her friends, like, hey, have you seen Cayce? Have you seen Cayce? And they're like, no, but we'll watch out for her. I guess they all had plans to go to like a barbecue/pool party the next day. Some church members had a barbecue and a pool. They invited all the girls over to have a party. And so the girls who knew her were like waiting for her to show up, Maybe she went out and did something and she was just gonna like come to the party and then they could be relieved, but she never showed up there either. So initially when she was reported missing, police treated the case as a runaway case, as they oftentimes do when it's a teenager, but immediately that didn't like ring true to those who knew her, particularly Amber, because Amber's like, listen, you're telling me that she probably ran off and maybe she went off with some boy, she'll come back. Well, we're best friends. Even if Cayce was going to lie to her mom and say she was at my house and then run off with some boy, she would tell me so I could cover for her. So that sounds like bullshit. Plus, none of Cayce's belongings were taken. Like, nothing was missing, not even her shoes. She was barefoot. Like, that didn't make any sense. Now, in some reports, it says that the police started searching for Cayce the day after she was reported missing. So that would have been Sunday, which would have been like 2 days since she actually went missing. But I'm not sure how extensive the search was like the very next day, or if that's accurate, just simply because one, they were treating it as a runaway, so why would they start searching immediately? Usually police don't do that, though it could have happened. And two, another reason that I'm like, did it start right away is because Cindy came out and said that police didn't even show up to like their home to process the crime scene for like an entire week. And Cindy says, this is all from Cindy, Cindy says that when police finally did show up, they were critical at her and Steve for not keeping the home exactly how it was the night she disappeared, but they were like critical of police, like, okay, if it was so important, it's been a week, why weren't you here? Anyways, the search began eventually, and it started with the property behind Cindy's house. The FBI and TBI ended up being called in to help with the search because local police realized that this was a bit beyond them because, again, small town, less cases like this to practice with and fine-tune their skills. And I mean, when this happened, the Milan PD had just hired their first full-time investigator who ended up handling Cayce's case for the first few years. The investigators, like the local police, even went as far as reaching out to local and national media to help get the word out, and they even reached out to America's Most Wanted to try to get them to cover the case on Cayce. Flyers were posted all over the area asking for help and offering rewards for any information leading to Cayce's return, and Cayce was described as being 5'4", 120 pounds with wavy brown hair, brown eyes, and a strawberry birthmark on the underside of her lower left arm, and she was said to likely be wearing a silver friendship necklace that had a pendant of half of a heart. Volunteers from all over came to help in the search. They searched the forest, 500 acres of property was searched. There were ponds dragged, like they were searching everywhere all over the county to try to find Cayce. But the problem was, among many problems, there's lots of problems in all of these cases, is that they were getting too many tips, and they were finding that a lot of the tips they were getting weren't incredibly credible tips, but because you couldn't figure out what was credible and what wasn't, because there was so little information to go on, they had to check out and exclude all of the tips. So it took a lot of manpower considering how little they had. And Officer Sellers, who was a 911 dispatcher at the time that Cayce went missing, but ended up being working up the ranks, I don't know how the system works there, but he ended up being the chief of police by the time her murderer was found, said of this, and I quote, "We just couldn't decide what tips were worth chasing and which weren't. So every one of them were checked out. Sometimes that meant flying an officer to another state because a person we were wanting to question had been arrested. So we would go where they were being held to question them." Sometimes that meant draining a pond or lake. All of those things took time and money, which I'm okay with doing if it helps us find Cayce. But in the past few years, we've gone back and questioned some of these witnesses, and some of them have admitted they've grown up since then and admitted they falsified reports back then, and whatever they told us wasn't true. So how much time was spent chasing rabbits we didn't need to chase? There were reports that came in the days after Cayce went missing that said that she had been seen in the presence of an adult male, both at a state fair and also at a Walmart. They would get calls that Cayce was dead and that her body had been thrown in like a river in West Tennessee or had been buried in some random location. Police flew helicopters and searched with sonar equipment and searched all through the woods, but in every search, they came up with nothing. A psychic even ended up being hired by Cindy, Cayce's mom. And this psychic reported that she had a vision that Cayce would be found in a place with a pond, fallen trees, a zoo, a playground, and a picnic area. And from this tip, police ended up searching this petting zoo and dragging a 5-acre pond, but they found nothing. There was even a search dog brought in to assist in the investigation, okay, to smell Cayce stuff and try to locate her. And this dog's name was Valerie, which, how cute is that? Dogs with like human names? Get out of here with that. I love it so much. Now, Valerie was brought to Cindy's home and given a piece of Cayce's clothes, some of Cayce's clothes to like smell, to get the main smell to follow. Baseline, that's what I'm looking for, to get like the baseline scent. And she followed her little nose, being a very good girl. And she ended up following the scent, like tracking the scent to a creek that was near the property that Cindy lived on, but lost it there. And Valerie was also taken to that state fair where Cayce had been seen with an adult man. Remember I told you about that? And at Walmart. So she was brought to this state fair, Valerie was, and supposedly she found Cayce's scent there as well. Now, I don't believe that Cayce was ever at the state fair, so I've got to be honest. I do question Valerie's credentials like a little bit. And I'm also sorry to tell you guys that Valerie has died because she was a very old dog. I don't know how she died, but like this was a long time ago. So Valerie has died, and I'm sorry to bring you guys that information, but I know it, so now you have to know it too. Now, at some point in the investigation, speaking of the man at the fair, a composite sketch was made and released based on this guy who was seen with Cayce at this fair. And again, I don't think she was ever at this fair, so I feel like this tip of her being with this man was bullshit. So any tips that came in from this sketch were also probably just a giant waste of time, though they wouldn't know that at the time. So they had all these tips that were wasting their time. Plus they got more tips because America's Most Wanted did end up featuring Cayce's case on their program. So they got even more tips that they had to sift through. So I can't even imagine how difficult this investigation was with all of the tips that were pointless, plus all of the tips that could have been something. It just seems like a lot for any force to handle. And from the tips that came in from America's Most Wanted, people were saying that they saw her from places as far away as Missouri to as far away as California. So apparently she was all over the map for people. Now it's really fucked up here, which like a lot of things are fucked up here, but one of the things that's messed up is, remember I told you that Cayce had an older brother named Randy who's 11 years older than her. Well, when Cayce went missing, Randy was in jail. I didn't see what it was for because it doesn't matter. But he was in jail. And so he didn't find out about Cayce going missing right away. I guess his family wanted to protect him from being like upset, already in like an upsetting situation. And they were hoping that they would find her before he would have to get the information. You know, they were trying to like spare him the knowledge that she was missing and hoping that things would just turn out well and that he would find out after the fact and be like, wow, that's crazy. But that it wouldn't be like an unhappy ending kind of thing. But time was going by and they were like, okay, we should probably tell him. So I guess some member of his family called the prison and left a message on the answering machine, like the prison answering machine. I don't know exactly how that works. Maybe it was the warden's answering machine. Basically, they left a message so that Randy could know. But Randy didn't get the message in time. So he was hanging out in prison, as one does, watching the TV, when the episode of America's Most Wanted came up on the screen and he sees his sister's face and he's like, oh my God, like that's my sister. And I guess like the prison friends that he had in jail were like, oh no, that's not her. That probably just looks like her, blah, blah, blah. But then in the episode, they said her name and he's like, no, like that's my sister. And Randy said that like at the time that this happened, he was already like an angry young man. So to learn this that way really upset him, as it would upset anybody. But he said it took him a really long time to stop being mad at his grandma for not doing more to make sure he found out in a different way, which is really sad. But I guess he's changed a lot since then. So, but can you imagine? Like, that's so sad. It makes my heart just like, ugh. I cannot imagine just sitting there and seeing somebody I love, seeing my sister just pop up on the TV screen as missing and nobody told me. I would be like, I don't know what I would be like, because that would be horrible. Now, police did all they could, right? They had a million leads that they chased down. They went as far as getting local and national coverage for the case. They reached out to America's Most Wanted. I believe even the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children got up in the mix. And all leads went to a dead end, so the case went cold. And it stayed cold till about 2017. And that's when new life was breathed into the case, when a podcast was started. And this was a podcast started by a man named Brandon Barnett, I believe. And it's a podcast called Searching for Ghosts. Now, I guess Brandon grew up in Jackson, which was about 25 miles away from Milan, and he was 22 at the time that Cayce went missing. And the case really stuck out to him, and it stuck out to his friends as well, even though, like, they didn't know her, right? They knew Milan a little bit, but not, you know, I don't know their whole relationship with the town. I know they didn't know Cayce, but to him it stuck out because, like, 14-year-old children just were not going missing from their homes in Milan, Tennessee. Now, I guess he started doing this podcast just because he wanted to bring awareness to the case. He wanted to, you know, maybe even solve it. Like, he wasn't going out trying to solve the case, but he definitely wanted to try to figure out what happened and to bring more awareness to the case. I guess what sparked it, like really sparked it, is that Cayce went missing right around the same time that JonBenét Ramsey was killed. And when the 20-year anniversary of JonBenét being killed and Cayce going missing came up, they did like this whole big thing for JonBenét, like we see all the time, which is totally reasonable. They should, and they should do it for all missing children, killed children, unsolved cases. I'm not going to get into that. That's how I feel. But with Cayce, there was just like a little blip, right? There was just a small thing. He barely even knew she was still missing at that time because nobody was talking about it. And he was kind of like a little peeved that one child from a nice, wealthy family in a nice, wealthy area is getting all of this attention, and this other girl whose case is still not solved as well is getting none. So he decided he wanted to do the podcast to bring attention to her case, and that ended up being like a wonderful thing because the slogan the family had been using for Cayce was "Speak Up for Cayce," and now Brandon was doing just that. He said that he hoped if anything came out of this, it would just get people to start talking, because he said, quote, "When people start talking, the truth isn't far behind," end quote. And he was really into true crime. I read, or I saw in an interview, one of the two, I watched a few things from him, that he really got into true crime from the podcast Serial, which, I mean, right now when I'm filming this, everything is breaking right now. Like, obviously these types of investigative podcasts can be beneficial in getting movement in cases, because look at Serial and look at frickin' Kristen Smart. Kristen Smart's killers were killer. One was acquitted, one wasn't. Was just found guilty. Well, I don't think that Paul's father took part in killing her. I think he probably took part allegedly in the cover-up. But either way, Your Own Backyard, Serial. These are both podcasts that were investigative podcasts that had humongous impacts on cases. So of course this made sense that could be a possibility if Brandon was to cover Cayce's case as well. And it did. It did. I'm so surprised that this podcast isn't more well known, considering it had the impact it did on this case. But anyway, go listen to his podcast. Go listen to Brandon's podcast. Go watch him on YouTube. He has a YouTube channel. I think it's just Searching for Ghosts. I will try to remember to link it in the description box here. But go watch it. Leave him a comment. Tell him I sent you. Tell him hi. Like, let him know people are paying attention to the work that he's doing, because he's still doing it. He's working on other cases, and I think he deserves more recognition. But Cayce's family has even come out and said that they owe a great deal to Brandon and his podcast for the work that he did, and that without him starting the podcast, they don't really know how far the case would have progressed or if they would have gotten the work done on it that they have gotten done now. And that's something that Cayce's cousin Lindsay has said. Like, I don't know if we'd be where we are now, which where we are now is with a solved case, if Brandon hadn't started this podcast. And I do think Lindsay is probably right. This is the type of podcast where he actually went out in the field, did the thing, spoke to the people, talked to locals, talked to people who are even considered suspects, talked to friends, talked to family, got theories from people. He even spoke to Cayce's mom, who Cindy became a bit elusive years after Cayce went missing, which we'll get into a little bit later. But she ended up calling him herself, Brandon. She called Brandon and she talked to him about her theories, and even gave him a suspect that she thought could be responsible for her daughter's death. And that, like, is invaluable, right? Like, that's all information that is vital, right, when looking into true crime. But speaking of suspects, let's get into the initial suspects, because there were a few. The first was an 18-year-old young man named Charlie, which, first off, great name. But I guess Charlie and Cayce had developed a bit of a relationship despite the age difference, since he was, an adult and she was a child. And Cindy, when she found out about it, she just, like, was not into it because of a couple of reasons. But, teenagers, Cayce was like, you don't know him. And her mom was like, I don't give a fuck, I don't need to know him. Like, he's too old for you. And I guess he was known as being a bit of a violent guy. Like, that was true. And at the time that they were talking, I think when Cindy found out, they were pen pals because he was in jail. Though I did read that they met before jail. They actually met at church, but then they, continued their relationship when he was in jail. I read, because police actually did go to another town to question him. He was in jail in Nashville on, like, rape and assault charges. So, not a great guy, but a good suspect, right? Yeah. So that's one suspect. Another suspect was a man named Pete. This was a friend of Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Steve's, and he was said to have not been, like, a super great guy. And in addition to that, like, they had their list of suspects, like the FBI had a list of suspects, and they had narrowed down the whole list of suspects, and everybody was able to be excluded by their alibi except for Pete. And Pete actually had lied about his alibi. He had given his wife as an alibi, and I guess she lied for him, and later it came out that it wasn't a real alibi, so he was looking like a good suspect as well. And then there was the last suspect I'm going to mention, and this was the first suspect on police's radar in the first place, and that was Cindy, Cayce's mother. She was the one that police first looked into, and police have said that their biggest roadblock in looking into this case was Cindy herself. Cindy had a hard life. She was a smart kid growing up with straight A's, but she grew up super poor and on Section 8, and her dad was said to have been an alcoholic when she was growing up, and that she got smacked around quite a lot as a kid. She grew up knowing that she had to hustle and surround herself with people who did the same. She went on, to surround herself with people who did the same. And as she got older, she didn't hang out with the best crowd. Many of hers and her boyfriend's friends had trouble with the law and drugs and alcohol as well. And some police officers thought that Cindy knew more than she was saying about what happened to Cayce, and that maybe it was what happened to Cayce had something to do with, like, a bad drug debt. And you'll hear this a lot. This was a really big theory in this case, before it was solved, of course, that Cindy owed somebody money for drugs and that Cayce's life was stolen to pay for that debt, essentially. Now, I think there are several reasons that people fixated on Cindy as a possible suspect in this case. I think namely, like, the first one that comes to my mind is the way that she found the home. To come home and the back door be open and cookies and milk sitting out in front of the TV, clothes there, shoes there, and her just gone. I think that that's a weird scene, right? I can totally see that. Her not freaking out right away and waiting 10 hours to report her daughter missing after finding the house that way. I think that's weird. And I will be honest, when I first started looking into this case, because I look into the timeline before learning who did it, kind of thing. That's how I like to research, so I can get all the information. Actually, it depends on the case, but in this particular case, that's what I did. I was like, damn, it sounds like Cindy's involved. I'm not gonna lie, that was my initial reaction, was that her mom did have something to do with it. Even Amber, Cayce's best friend, has said, like, as an adult woman herself, and I believe she's a mother now, that she does not understand Cindy's decision making during that time, that she could not have walked into that house, seen that scene, and thought everything was fine. But Cindy explains these things away, first saying that she really, really just thought, the reason she didn't call, the reason she didn't freak out or anything, is that she really did think that Cayce was at Amber's, and that people have over-exaggerated the back door being open, that it wasn't wide open like people are saying, that it was just slightly unlatched from, opening the front door and the pressure change or whatever, making the door unlatch. And she also says that she really believed that Amber and Cayce were together, and that's why the next day, like, she called Amber and wasn't, like, freaking out or anything. She was just, like, put Cayce on the phone because she was, like, kind of pissed off that she hadn't came home, was going to kind of give her a little shit about it, and that she didn't realize something was wrong until Amber told her that Cayce wasn't there, and that's when she freaked out, and that's when she went home, and that's the point in time when she found the cookies and milk, that she had not found them the night before, and that was misreported. But despite these explanations, the locals, people that knew her, were still suspicious. Even people in her own family were still suspicious of her. And police were still suspicious of her. They brought her in. They gave her a polygraph test. They actually gave her more than one. I believe they gave her 2. And she failed both of them. And when she did, she like freaked out and she yelled and she said like the FBI was threatening her, which supposedly they weren't. That's what people were saying, like people in law enforcement were saying they weren't. And that she said she was never going to meet with them again. And she didn't. She was like, that's it. I wash my hands of this. You guys, you're threatening me. And she just stopped like speaking with police. And on top of that, another reason people thought that Cindy was weird is that I heard on Brandon's podcast, because I did listen to it, people's accounts of what happened, that a group got together from their church and like got together to go and search for Cayce, and they went to Cindy's house wanting to like search the property for Cayce, and that either Cindy or Steve chased them off and told them that they couldn't. Now that is weird. I don't know the full story. We're just getting this little blip. There's no context there. And it's not even proven as fact that this happened, but this is another one of those things that people are saying that gets spread around that makes people suspicious of Cindy. And on top of that, 10 years after Cayce went missing, Cindy just went missing. She just disappeared. No one knew where she was. No one knew where to find her. She stopped showing up at vigils for her daughter. And this didn't help people's suspicion. It made, really, her disappearing made breathe new life into people thinking she had something to do with it and bred more and more theories and suspicion around her. But she said that she just couldn't keep being around there and couldn't keep going to these vigils and seeing these people and watching all of Cayce's friends grow up and move on with their lives when her daughter couldn't do the same. But Cindy was very active in the beginning. That's the thing, is she was active in the beginning when Cayce went missing, trying to find her. She helped raise funds to bring in Valerie, you know, the search dog. She also did press conferences, like asking them to not forget about Cayce, and she brought in that psychic to try to figure out what happened to her. Cindy said that a lot of the people who made up theories and rumors about her and thought that she was involved in Cayce's disappearance were people that didn't know her that well and people that she like knew before high school and didn't know who she was at this point. And she said like the worst part of it was when people would say that she had forgotten about her daughter. And she said specifically of this, and I quote, "When people say you forgot about your child, you have to get really tough skin. But you know, it still bothers you. But she's never been forgotten. She'll never be forgotten." And to this day, as far as I know, at least at the time of this interview, she had a photo of Cayce up above the fireplace to always remind her of the daughter that was lost. And the rest of Cayce's family didn't lose hope either. Like they were really holding out hope that she'd be found or that the case would be solved. Even as recently as 2017, they held a vigil for Cayce. And this was a year before an arrest was finally made. And this vigil was set up by Cayce's cousin, Lucas. And about 400 friends, family, neighbors all met together in this large auditorium with candles to remember the girl who disappeared before she ever really got a chance to live her life. Cayce's childhood best friend Amber attended and spoke at her vigil. And I guess the two were so close. Remember I said that they were like really close friends? They were so close that at Amber's wedding, because she eventually got married, she had a candle lit for Cayce. And I said there were 400 people at this vigil. Well, I guess the last vigil they had been 6 years earlier. And at that time, only 25 people had shown up. But now in 2017, there's 400 people. And I don't think this is a coincidence because 2017 is also when the podcast came out. And so I think there was a little bit of like people learning about her, coming together, her being remembered, which is exactly what he had set out to do. And a member of the church actually came up to, like the church where it was held, came up to Cayce's cousin before the vigil was over and was like, "Listen, I want us to keep doing this here every single year until she is found." Chief of Police Sellers was also at the vigil, and he said that he had 5 officers who were specifically assigned to Cayce's case. And he said of investigating Cayce's case, and I quote, "When I became chief, I made a promise to myself to do everything humanly possible. That when I stop being chief here, that I can put my head down at night knowing I did all I could. I want to find her and bring whoever did this to justice. And I promise the family we're doing what we can." Also present at this vigil was Brandon Barnett, the host of the podcast, Searching for Ghosts. And he spoke to the crowd saying, and I quote, "I never met Cayce. I didn't know her, but I lived in Jackson when she went missing, and something had to be done. I went back and forth about doing it for a couple of years, and then finally decided to do it, and felt guilty for waiting so long, because this needs to stay in the front of everyone's minds." Now, I'm going to discuss a theory. This is a theory that was thrown out that involves Cindy, okay, being involved in her daughter's disappearance, but in a passive way. A passive way, but a horrible way, where she wasn't responsible for hurting or killing her daughter, but she was involved in the cover-up after the fact. Now, I'm going to say right now, I'm not saying this happened, but this is something that is worth mentioning because it kind of bridges us into what actually did happen. Because you remember I told you that Cindy called Brandon from Searching for Ghosts and told him her theory and who she thought was responsible for Cayce's disappearance. Well, this was a man named Pete. And Pete, if you recall, was one of the suspects that police could not nail down an alibi for. And this theory involves Pete as well. Now, I heard this theory on the podcast, Searching for Ghosts, and it was a woman who Brandon Barnett spoke to. And I'm not saying this happened. This is what she's saying that she heard. So it was all kind of hearsay situation. But basically, she said that she was related to this guy, Pete, by marriage. And that she was told by Pete's mother that Pete was responsible for Cayce's disappearance. And that when Pete got arrested for an unrelated crime involving a woman at a car wash, which we are going to get into, he called his mother and told her to get rid of a gun that he had used to kill Cayce. This source also said that Pete was present at the party that Cindy and Steve went to, and that Cindy and Steve had got to the party and Pete was there, and Pete had been like, oh, when's Cayce gonna get home? Like, he knew Cayce. And that they told him, like, oh, when she's gonna get home from the party, her like school dance, and that shortly after that, he made some obscene gestures to somebody at the party saying that he was gonna leave to go get some. In this story, Pete then leaves. He goes to Cindy's house where Cayce is there alone, and when he knocks on the door, she lets him in because she knew him. But at that point, he started making sexual advances towards her, and he was known to be a sexually violent man. It's said at this point that he raped her repeatedly, and in the commission of doing so, he had hurt her badly enough to the point that he thought that she had a head injury or maybe even a broken neck. So knowing he couldn't get her medical assistance and that she would need it, he instead pulled out a gun and shot her in the head in her own living room. So this would have been Cindy's living room. It was then said that at this point, Cindy and Steve left their party, got home, and found the scene, and for whatever reason helped him cover it up and helped him, they even cleaned the carpet with a power washer, really went to town cleaning up this house. And supposedly, people who knew Cindy said that the house was unusually clean after Cayce went missing. The laundry was washed, the clothes she'd been wearing that night were washed, and that wasn't common, and that the carpet was wet, it had been cleaned. Now, this is where it gets kind of weird and complicated, but this person is now saying that the reason that nobody found out about it is that everybody involved was in some sort of drug ring, including the sheriff at the time in the town. Again, this is all alleged, somebody saying, that the sheriff knew about it and that the sheriff was somehow friends with Pete and Pete's family. So the sheriff found out about it and was like, don't tell anyone, don't say anything. And that also a member of the church was involved in it, and that Cayce's body was then taken and kept at this cabin that this person from the church owned, and everybody was involved in it because everyone was part of this drug ring. This is a part that loses me. Conspiracies are a little bit tough for my brain, even though I love spooky and conspiracy theory stuff. I find it hard to believe that so many people can keep a secret for so long, just in general. But then the person goes on to say that after that, some time goes by, a couple days, and Pete shows back up to Cindy's house with a vehicle and picks up Steve, and anyways, yeah, she says that the sheriff pushed it under the rug because of the drug ring. Sure. She says then Pete shows back up to Cindy's house a couple of days later to pick up Steve, and he's brought with him shovels and a tarp, all the things you would need to presumably dispose of a body, and that Steve and Pete left together. But that before they left together, Cindy dropped to her knees and grabbed Steve's legs and was like, don't do it, don't do it. So that's a wild story, right? There's things about it that just don't make sense to me. The motive for Cindy and Steve to even cover for this guy, they weren't said to have been very close, and Cindy even comes out saying that she didn't like him that much, that he would try to advance on her and she would tell him no. So that part's lost on me, but it's one of those things that got spread around. It didn't help that there were also rumors that somehow Cayce had ended up at the adult party that Cindy and Steve were at. There were so many different rumors in this case, right, that just made everyone look more at Cindy and more suspiciously at Cindy. And normally, I wouldn't even mention a rumor like this, but it is something that I heard about, and it did involve Pete, and it does matter considering what happened in 2019. More than 23 years after Cayce McDaniel went missing from her home, FBI was able to use new technology to go into her childhood home and look for new forensic evidence that might have been missed or that they didn't have like the technology to recover at the time she went missing. The FBI brought in an evidence collection team, and they were all wearing these like white hazmat looking suits and removing bags and bags of evidence from the home and like ranging in all different sizes, and some things were even big enough that they needed like 2 cops to carry it. Like they were taking stuff out of that house. I guess no like local officers were allowed in and no media was allowed in, but Cindy was there. She went in with the FBI and she sort of like reenacted what her and Steve, like Steve wasn't there, they weren't even together anymore at this point, but what her and Steve did when they got home that night, which is another thing. Like if she was, it doesn't matter. Anyways, it's just so wild to think that police were able to get anything from this house after this much time, because this house was a rental. Cindy didn't own this house, so they weren't even living in it anymore, and like several occupants had been living in that house throughout the years. Like there was still somebody living in it at the time that police went in to search it again. But from what I read, I guess the house really hasn't changed since 1996. Like police said a lot of the home, including the floorboards and wall panels, are all the same as it was when Cayce disappeared back in 1996, which is like not a good look for the landlord, I'll say that, but it's good for investigators. I guess at the interior, even the front yard is pretty much unchanged after 20 years. I mean, I guess like the front yard is like smaller now because the road used to be just like a 2-lane road and it's expanded, so the yard's a bit smaller, but the house is basically the same. That's just great. 20 years? No renovations? Landlords in LA, you move out after 2 years and they want to make you pay to redo the entire freaking carpets in a house. Like, it was after searching Cayce's childhood home, after all of these years, that charges were finally brought against someone in relation to her disappearance. And the man that they believed was responsible was a man named Finis Hill. And you're probably like, who the fuck is Finis Hill? Because we haven't heard that name before. Except you haven't, but you've heard of him before. Finis went by another name. Cayce knew him as Uncle Pete. Now, I don't know a ton about Pete. Not that I'd want to, because to be honest, he sounds like a real dick, but he grew up in Humboldt in a blended family with 10 half-siblings between his mother and his father. And I guess all those kids might have been too much for the couple, because Pete was said to have mostly lived with his grandmother. And that is when he wasn't in a home for boys, or a state correctional facility, or in juvie, because he was just getting into some trouble from a young age. He was said to have joined the Marines when he was old enough to do so, and that he had then gone on to be successful in his work as a car salesman, but less successful in his love life. Like, he had been married 4 times. So like, he was successful in getting somebody to like hang out with him and like bugs with him, but he wasn't successful in like keeping those relationships going long-term. Longevity wasn't his strong suit. That probably has something to do with him being a dirtbag loser. In 2003, he pled guilty to a firearms charge, like possessing a firearm while being a felon, essentially, when he approached a woman with a gun and tried to abduct her. Apparently the woman's name was Brockney, and she was at a car wash at around 2 a.m. when Pete Hill approached her with a gun and told her to get into his car. She said she immediately felt uneasy when he like pulled his car up next to hers and felt him approaching her when he started walking up, so she like turned over and quickly grabbed his arm holding the gun, which, first off, girl power. And I guess the two like started to fight, and she was like, listen, here, take my money, take my purse, whatever. And he's like, I don't want your money. You need to get in my car. And she's like, well, I'm not gonna get in my car. And he's like, well, you need to get in the car. I have a gun and I will blow your brains out. And she was just like tough as hell. And she like grabbed her phone. She's like, you know what? Actually, I'm just gonna call the cops right now. How about that? Like, brave woman. And I guess this like worked, because he left after this. He got in his car and he sped away. And she said of this, and I quote, I was more aggressive than he was, but he had the gun and was the one telling me to get in the car. I was furious. I didn't get scared until he left, and then I was terrified. She also said she'll never forget looking into his eyes, that they were totally dead eyes, completely lacking emotion. So he was caught, obviously. Like, he left a fingerprint on the area where he had been washing his car, and then Brockney was able to identify him. So he went to jail, and he was given 18 years and 6 months plus 3 years of supervised release. So now he's connected to Cayce's disappearance, right? And he was actually in custody when he was connected to Cayce's disappearance, kind of. It's a little bit sticky. I'm going to tell you about it. But when Brockney found out he was rearrested, she was like really relieved that he had been, but was worried that he had hurt somebody else, because she knew exactly what he was capable of. Pete Hill was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated rape. At the time he was arrested and indicted on these charges, he was already being held in federal custody on 2 counts of child exploitation charges, using the internet to entice a minor to engage in criminal sexual activity, and traveling from Tennessee to Mississippi to meet up with a person he believed to be under 16 and engage in illicit sexual activity. So, dirtbag. Ugh, dirtbag. Now, if you're like me, you're like, damn, that's a lot of charges. What gives? Let me explain. I'm going to explain to you right now, so you can now know, like, why he was in custody, but already kind of suspected, and why things got a little bit weird. I'm going to tell you right now. So, he gets released on supervised leave, right? He has those 3 years of supervised leave. And police are already kind of onto him for Cayce's disappearance, but they don't have enough evidence to, like, convict him yet, right? So they're trying to gather that evidence, and they're like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a task force, and we're going to find out as much information as we can. And basically how he got caught, like, for the exploitation charges and those other charges, is he got caught up in a sting operation. Basically, a female officer set up a fake social media page to, like, speak with Pete, and she pretended to be a mother of, like, a young daughter, and the two talked for a long time. They talked for a while trying to get information out of him. But during the commission of talking to him, I guess his behavior became erratic, and they believed that he was in the process of looking for a new victim. And they wanted to keep talking to him and get more information out of him, but because they thought he was looking for a new victim, they decided to speed things along a little bit. And this is when they arranged to meet him at a hotel or a motel, a Holiday Inn, in Mississippi. So we drove all the way there, and when he got there, they were like, "What you here for, guy? You here to meet an underage girl, a la, you know, Catch a Predator?" And so he got caught up that way. And, like, think about this for a second. This is something that blew my mind. He was arrested in 2005 and given 18 years. Got out for his 3 years for supervised release and immediately was like, I am ready to hurt someone else again. Like, immediately. Like, that is a predator. That is somebody who would continue. Like, he wasn't deterred at all from being in jail for 18 years. Think about that for a second. Think about the type of person that is. In these messages with this woman, he told this woman, this cop, that he liked to chase women down, beat them, rape them, and that he had at least once had sex with a 14-year-old girl. Okay? And then he arranged to go to Mississippi to meet up with this woman and her young daughter and to have sex with both of them. But when he got there, police were waiting instead. And I guess, like, she had mentioned, like, the kind of candy and shit, or, like, something. I think it was candy that, like, the daughter liked, and he had that, like, condoms and shit in his car. So, Pete's a bad guy, and he's in jail, and he's facing up to 30 years for these charges. And I think that was a little bit of a placeholder. Well, that's bad. Don't get me wrong. Like, that's fucked up. But I think they did that so they could kind of have him in a safe place where they knew he wasn't going to hurt anybody, while they then investigated Cayce's case a little more, got him connected to that, and then he was charged with her rape and murder as well. Chief Sellers said at this time his #1 goal was to find Cayce and bring her home and give her a proper burial, that he had always hoped that she'd come back, that she would just, like, walk back into her mother's home in Milan and just be perfectly fine and okay. But based on how much time had gone by, it didn't seem likely that that was going to be the case here. Sellers actually became, like, super invested in this case. I guess he was friends with, like, members of Cayce's family, and he kept in contact with them over the decades as the search continued. And after years, he had been promoted to chief of police, right? And he made the investigation a renewed priority under his reign, assigning a full-time investigator to work on it alongside the FBI and other agencies that helped with the case. And he said of his, like, dedication and his want to solve this case, and I quote, "Other than the family, I don't think anyone wants to know what happened to Cayce more than me. And I told my wife one night at home, when I'd just been promoted to chief in February of 2014, I want justice served on the one responsible for this. And if we can find out where she is so we can bring her home to the family, I want to get that done before I retire." Once he was arrested, Pam Flowers, I wonder if that's the Pam who drove her home that night. I didn't see that it was the same person. Maybe, I guess there's more than one person named Pam that exists in the world, but anyway. Pam Flowers, her aunt, expressed gratitude to the police for all the work that they did, and also sent out her, like, thoughts and prayers to those who are suffering from missing a loved one and not knowing specifically what happened. She said of the arrest, and I quote, "We still have a long road ahead of us, but Cayce's family is relieved to know that the person responsible is behind bars and hopefully will spend the rest of his life in prison. Our hearts are hurting knowing she is gone. We'll have answers now, but what we wish more than anything is that Cayce was still here with us and that this had never happened." Thank God this man will never be able to hurt another child. Now, it appears that, like, the police have been on to Pete for a very long time. Sellers said in an interview that they had one suspect that kept coming up over and over in their investigation, and I believe that that was Pete. And he said that this suspect, Cindy had even brought it to their attention, which we know that Cindy brought up Pete. And that's another thing that makes me think that Cindy's not involved. Like, people are like, Cindy's involved. Like, why would she be like, hey, go check out Pete. I helped Pete cover up. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't make sense that she would try to get him arrested when it could very easily come back on her as well. You know what I mean? She told police that the night of the party, she and Steve were just leaving, and as they were leaving, Pete had just arrived. And that Pete and her didn't really get along, that he was really interested in her, like, sexually, and would always make advances at her, and she would tell him, like, to fuck off, and that she would tell her boyfriend about it, and this pissed him off. And she theorized that Pete had assumed that just Steve was going to the party. So he had shown up at her house looking for her alone so he could make advances on her again, because he had done this many times before. But when he got there, it was Cayce who was there alone, and that he took out his anger with Cindy on Cayce. She said of this, and I quote, "He gets all mad, you know? Nobody turns Pete Hill down. Just got irate about it." Anyways, on October 18th, 2019, Pete Hill was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated rape, and he was held without bond. I guess even though, like, there was only one murder, Cayce, obviously, the indictment says that he's facing charges for first-degree murder, including premeditation, and murder in the preparation of a rape, which are 2 separate charges. And on the rape charges, since there were 2 rape charges, as I said, one of the rape charges says that Pete used a deadly weapon during the assault, and the other charge is that he caused bodily injury during the rape. And the indictment also said that he took steps to conceal Cayce's remains after the fact as well. I hope all that made sense. It made sense in my brain. Did it make sense coming out of my mouth? Who's to say? You'll let me know. Lindsay, Cayce's cousin, said of the indictment in reading what he was charged with, and I quote, "Our worst thoughts and fears are being realized. They're real, and this happened. I think we all imagine what probably happened, but reading the charges and seeing everything makes it real, and it's very unsettling." Another vigil was held for Cayce in 2018, and this was after Pete was arrested. So this vigil was huge for many reasons. One, all these people had waited years and years, decades to find out what happened to Cayce. Now they finally had some idea and a little bit of closure. And for another thing, this vigil was the first time in like years that the whole family was there. Cindy was up on the stage. Cayce's aunts, cousins, family from her dad's side of the family were all on stage together. And this hadn't happened before this. You know what I mean? Like, everybody just needed the answer so that they could, it got me here. It got me here. On the year that Cayce would have turned 40 years old, Pete Hill, who was now 70 years old, entered a plea deal. He entered a, quote, best interest plea, end quote, for criminal responsibility to commit second-degree murder and abuse of a corpse, which basically amounts to a guilty plea. And in exchange for this, he was given a 15-year sentence. 15 years, that's it. He does have to serve the entire thing. He can't, like, get out early. But after he does his 15 years, he'll be 85 years old, and he will be paroled, and he'll have to be, watched for 6 years after that. And the other charges he had against him, the state and federal charges for, like, the child exploitation, that shit, that was all dropped in his arrangement. Yeah. He was like, please don't charge me with those things as well. Please, because that makes me look real bad. And they were like, okay. Apparently they were saying, like the court records say, that this would have been a very difficult case to prosecute. Like, they believed it was him. They had strong evidence to believe it was him, but it wasn't strong enough, they didn't think, to get a conviction, and he would not admit to the murder or the rape, but he did give them information on where he believed Cayce's body might have been buried. Basically, they spoke to Cayce's family, including her brother, and they came to the arrangement. They got their permission first, so they didn't just, do it and not tell them, from what I read. And that's something, right? Because can you imagine if they just did it? I don't know if they legally can. I think they legally can, but the family, I imagine, just wants to be able to put this to rest, wants to be able to find her, right? And I guess a condition of this deal also is that he cannot appeal. Like, he can't try to get less time. So by the time he gets out, he'll be 85. He doesn't have much life left. He's already lived all the life he would get to live, so that's something, I guess, that he doesn't get any more freedom. Another part of his plea deal states that he has to stay cooperative with the police and help them try to locate Cayce's body until she is found. Now, I am curious how they can really enforce that. Like, if he just decides to stop telling them, what can they really do? I don't know, but I guess they've already like searched for her several times. He gave them like a very specific location to look in, and they've done multiple different ways of trying to uncover her, but thus far, at the time I'm filming this, they haven't found her yet. And the DA said of this, and I quote, "Given what we know about the case, we understand, and after 26 years, we face a difficult task." Which, when I read that, it makes me wonder. It makes me think of locations, and immediately my mind goes to her being somewhere in water, or perhaps somewhere in a dump, somewhere that's ever changing, which makes it difficult for them to pin down exactly where she is. And that is where we currently stand. Pete is in jail. They're trying to recover Cayce's body. And Pete is the only person who has been charged with anything in this case. And that's something that's worth remembering for people who were so suspicious of Cindy. Because if Cindy was involved, I'm certain that Pete would have used that to save his skin a little bit. I can't imagine he'd have some sort of loyalty to her or to Steve where he wouldn't rat them out. He has no way to appeal. He has no way to get out early. He could have done something more, you know what I mean? Like, oh, I'll give you the mother and the bot. You know what I mean? Like, he had options and he's not doing that. And this right here is exactly why I don't like to cover unsolved cases. Because if I had gone into this and I did not know what happened, I suspected Cindy initially. You know what I mean? And this is a perfect example of the fact that police know more than we know. You know what I mean? Like, you can think anything you want to think, but we don't know. It can look so much like one thing and not be that thing. This is a great example of that. The Brittany Drexel case, great example of that. And that's why I'm very like apprehensive about unsolved cases and theories and things like that, because these are people's lives. These are people's lives. And I want to leave you with one thing that I thought was just like wonderful, something that touched my heart in such a way, and I thought that it would touch your heart in such a way as well. Cindy's brother, Randy, you remember Randy? Well, Randy went on to be better. You know, he had been in jail. Now he's in recovery. He's found God. Everything's going really good for him. And he went on to have a daughter. And this daughter shares the same birthday as Cayce. And with that said, that, my friends, is the story of the disappearance of Cayce Lynn McDaniel. And now that I've given you all the information and told you all the things about the case, everything you might want to know, I want you to answer this question, and that is this. The question of the day, and that is this. What do you think happened the night that Cayce McDaniel disappeared? Let me know in the comments below. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and it gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, thank you for remembering Cayce with me today. I hope I did the case justice. I know there's a lot to it. And Brittany, I hope, you know, this was what you wanted from me when suggesting this case. I hope, you know, I just hope I did it justice. I always hope I do these cases justice. And don't forget, of course, to leave something nice for the family in the comments in case they see this, especially since Brittany's friends with her brother. And don't forget to check out Brandon's podcast, Searching for Ghosts, because he did a great job and deserves all sorts of virtual hugs for doing something that I consider to be such a dangerous thing. Investigative podcasting is something I don't think I could ever do. I think it's a very special person who would put themselves out there in that way, putting themselves in harm's way for one, putting themselves in financial, you know what I mean? There's like so much that goes into it, and I think that it is very commendable, and it's done for the right reasons, and that's great. Anyways, if you haven't already, don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing the bell. I put out a new video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below, along with a link to my merch store where you can get this shirt and other shirts, beanies, mugs, jizz, shit like that. Oh my god. There will also be a link to my membership where you can get things like polls, impromptu live streams, early access to unsponsored videos, things like that. So all that stuff will be linked down below for your convenience. I want to say one more thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video, and one more thank you to you guys for always being so supportive of my sponsors. You rock. Don't ever change. And now with all of that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.